Hello, you're watching the Daily Report for Tuesday, February 15th. Geopolitical tensions are adding to the list of potential risks to economic recovery this year. We have details later on the programme. Here first is the global pandemic update with our Kwonswa. So let's begin with the local tallies.
Sunny, Korea posted yet another record high of COVID-19 infections this Tuesday, surpassing 57,000 for the first time. This is the tally as of 12 a.m. and that includes more than 57,000 domestic transmissions and 165 cases from abroad. This is also a rise from imported cases the day before. And also today's caseload marks a surge by more than 20,000 cases from a week ago, and also the average number of daily cases in the past 7 days now stands at around 54,000. And if we go over to our map, there's been not an uptick in all parts of the country. There's been actually some decreases in the center of the country, but in the capital region, all three places, Seoul, Gyeonggi-do province and Incheon, have seen a rebound in infections this Tuesday. And with that, Korea has more than 1.46 million cases in total, and also 7,163 COVID-19 related deaths, with an uptick in fatalities. 61 people have lost their lives in the past day. Meanwhile, also the number of patients in severe or critical condition has gone up slightly to 314, so standing in the 300s for the second straight day. On to our vaccination figures. 87.2% and 86.2% of the nation's population has received their first or second shot respectively, and the number of people who got an additional dose, that has risen by around 191,000 who got their shot yesterday, and now 57.7% have gotten that booster shot. Let's take a look at the global figures. 1.7 million new infections were reported in the past day, with more than 10,000 COVID-19 deaths. And there are also still some countries that are reporting six-digit figures of daily increases, including the US, Russia and Germany. And those are the general updates I have for now, but I'll see you back in a bit. Sunny?
All right, so thank you for the global tallies of the past 24 hours. Back on the local front, earlier this week, the number of patients in critical condition rose to the 300 level for the first time in 17 days. For more, Shin Yeon joins me now. Shin Yeon, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Sunny.
Right, so let's begin with the uptick then in the number of serious infections.
Right. I guess the silver lining in our Omicron outbreak, though, is that up until now, most of the infections were mild, with hospitalization and deaths holding relatively steady despite the exponential jump in case counts. But as Hwa briefly mentioned, on Tuesday, the number of those critically ill surpassed 300 for the second straight day. The exact figure is 314. And authorities are expecting this number to rise even further, with the elderly starting to take up a larger proportion of our new cases. In the fourth week of January, we actually saw 6,655 people over the age of 60 being infected with the virus. But this figure has more than doubled to 14,527 in the first week of February. And with seniors being at higher risk of developing serious illnesses, KDCA Chief Chung Eun-kyung issued this warning.
As the overall number of new infections increased, we've also seen the number of seniors over 60 infected double in just a week. This may increase the number of deaths and those who are critically ill.
Right. Now, as part of efforts to perhaps tackle that potential threat, Yeon, authorities are offering a second booster dose to those at high risk. Tell us more.
Sure, Sunny. Korea is planning to administer fourth doses to those with weak immune systems, as well as residents and staff at senior care facilities. As of Monday, the immunocompromised are eligible to get their second boosters at any time, and those in nursing centers will be able to get their jabs from next month. The fourth COVID-19 vaccine shot can be administered 4 months after the third shot. Authorities, however, did not expand their target group to include more of the population in their offer of fourth doses.
Right, I see. Moving forward, Yeon, what's the latest with regard to the future course of our prevention guidelines?
Well, the Prime Minister said the government must decide whether or not to ease measures this week. He said that small business owners have been suffering from the pandemic for far too long. And the KDCA Commissioner on Monday also agreed and said restrictions could even be eased before our current guidelines expire on February 20th. Now, some of the key rules that could be in the target of easing include social gathering caps of 6 people and 9 p.m. shutdowns for restaurants and cafes. But the KDCA chief cautioned that if measures are to be eased, they should be done so gradually. She added that authorities are considering an end to the QR code check-in system that is currently in place at most venues. And this is because contact tracing is now being carried out in Korea on a self-reporting basis. But because QR codes have also been used as vaccine passes, the KDCA commissioner said authorities are reviewing ways to introduce separate QR codes just for vaccine verification.
Right, Yon, thank you for now, but do stay behind for more talks then. Now, earlier on this Tuesday morning, health officials addressed the direction of the country's future prevention guidelines. Right? Tell us more.
Right, Sunny. So let's continue from where Yin left off regarding social distancing measures, as this was addressed at the Central Disaster Management Headquarters briefing this Tuesday. Son Young-nae, a health ministry official, said that the government is currently aiming to announce this Friday which prevention guidelines the public will have to follow starting next week. He put more emphasis on the need for vaccine passes over social distancing rules, stressing that it's the unvaccinated population only, so a minority, that will face inconveniences from the system, but that it's also those the vaccine pass system aims to protect. He added, currently 4% of adults aged 18 and above have not been inoculated.
Right. And so what is the government's assessment with regard to Korea's rise in death toll that you reported for this Tuesday?
Right. As I mentioned earlier, 61 people have lost their lives in the past 24 hours as of 12 a.m. this Tuesday. And according to an official at the briefing earlier, these 61 fatalities include 4 people in their 50s, 5 in their 60s, 16 in their 70s, and 36 in their 80s. And 15 of them died at facilities such as nursing hospitals or nursing homes. So basically the elderly population, we know that there is a lag between deaths and the number of increases. But for now, officials say that it's not certain that today's figure is the result from the recent increases in the Omicron variant cases.
Daily death tolls fluctuate wildly and are highly volatile in nature, so it may be more appropriate to refer to 7-day moving averages for a more accurate picture of our fatalities. As of today, we have seen a daily average of 33.4 deaths in the past 7 days.
That average, however, does also translate into a recent rise from the late 20s to around 30 deaths on a daily basis. Now, there's also a slight rise in the operation of ICU beds for patients in severe or critical condition, although medical capacity is being maintained at a stable level with a little over 2,600 ICU beds and 26.8% of those in operation.
So I hear officials also touched upon Korea's recent transition into an Omicron-tailored testing and treatment strategy. Tell us about that.
Yes, so noting that it's been around a week since the government made that shift, a health ministry official Park Kyang acknowledged there has been some confusion and shortcomings during that span, but the system now appears to have somewhat stabilized. And she also made this comparison.
We imposed very rigid countermeasures against COVID-19 in the last 2 years. We even wore level D protective suit in the early days of the pandemic, when we knew very little about the virus. We're now wearing lighter protection, and we also have a better understanding of the characteristics of COVID-19. That is why we are taking gradual steps toward a system where we can simply walk into our neighborhood clinic to get treated for the disease.
Looking forward to more regular medical facilities that can handle COVID-19 patients, Park mentioned that in the span of around 10 days, the number of neighborhood clinics that can diagnose and treat COVID-19 has jumped to over 4,000, with more facilities expected to participate. In terms of home recovery, Park said currently around 90% of patients are being treated at home. The number of medical facilities that are in charge of monitoring patients that need intensive management has been expanded to 676, meaning a maximum of around 200,000 people can be managed. Facilities in charge of regular patients that, for instance, take calls for consultations now stands at above 4,200.
Right. So I believe the task of purchasing medication also will become easier for home patients, right?
Right, Sunny. Starting tomorrow, so Wednesday, people in quarantine with a COVID-19 patient will be able to receive treatments at any pharmacies in their neighborhood, not just designated ones. However, that does not go for the Paxlovid treatment. For those, there are still designated pharmacies and medical facilities.
Right, good to know. Now, so let's expand our talk to include Yeon. Back on Monday, Yeon, you spoke of a ban on online sales of self-test kits, and in a more recent move, authorities, I understand, have set a ceiling on the price of these kits. Tell us more.
That's right. To prevent stockpiling and overinflated markups, the government has banned online sales and is allowing people to buy a maximum of 5 kits at any one time in a single location. And from tomorrow, all online sales of kits will be forbidden following the end of a grace period. And anyone who buys or sells them online will be penalized. And as you mentioned, the government has granted a 3-day grace period from Sunday in consideration of surplus inventory. As for the cost, the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety has set a price cap of 6,000 Korean won, which is around $5 for one test kit. And the price ceiling is now in effect, but there could be exceptions depending on whether or not pharmacies or convenience stores bought them in bulk. Now, this measure will run through March 5th for now, but already it's come under fire with some citizens saying that the move has actually raised the market price for kits. Before, up until last month, people could buy a kit for $2 to $3 online, and they say that limiting sales to offline stores only at a maximum of 5 each has only made them more expensive. Also, some pharmacists who receive the kits in bulk have actually said that because they have to separate them manually, and $5 wouldn't be enough to pay for the additional work that they're doing.
But what we must not forget is that we still can go to the temporary testing centers to get tested for free with these self-test kits. And also there is an alternative to the test centers, which can have long lines in some cases, depending on where you live. You can also get tested at local clinics. And as I mentioned before, they have expanded those as well to roughly over 4,000. And also when you go to those neighborhood clinics, you have to pay 5,000 won, or roughly $4 for a diagnosis fee. So in that case, it would cost you a little less than purchasing one of those test kits at pharmacies.
Right, and staying with self-testing kits, I understand that testing will become mandatory within the academic arena. So tell us about that.
Right, Sunny. The government is looking to use self-test kits as a preemptive means of testing for the new school year. Now, an official at the Education Ministry said on Monday that all students at elementary, middle and high schools, as well as kindergarten kids, are expected to be tested for COVID-19 negativity before returning to school for the new semester in March. Instructors are also expected to be tested. Now, that would be an expansion from an earlier plan to only test those age groups that cannot get vaccinated, so the youngest population. And next Monday, the test kits for around 3.3 million kids at kindergartens and elementary schools were to be distributed for free, with tests to be conducted twice a week for 5 weeks. But after this recent decision, I believe that more test kits are going to be distributed, and the Education Ministry, in fact, is expected to hold a briefing on the details on who exactly will be subject to this and on how often they have to take these tests. And that briefing is expected to be held tomorrow on Wednesday.
Right, and you will probably update us on that tomorrow then. Thank you for the latest on the local front. So, and thank you for your input. See you on Wednesday.
Thank you so much.
The U.S. is relocating its embassy in Ukraine. The move comes amid, quote, a dramatic acceleration in Russian deployment on the Ukrainian border. Kim Yo-san reports.
Washington is closing the U.S. Embassy in Kiev and relocating its staff to Lviv in western Ukraine. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said Monday that the decision was made due to a dramatic acceleration in the buildup of Russian forces along the border. He also urged any remaining Americans in Ukraine to leave immediately. Speaking on Monday with his Ukrainian counterpart, Blinken stressed Washington's commitment to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. He added that any further military aggression by Russia will be met with a swift, coordinated, and forceful response. However, he did stress that Washington's immediate priority is to support diplomatic efforts to de-escalate tensions. This comes as the Pentagon said Moscow had strengthened its forces along the Ukrainian border over the weekend. Elsewhere, the European Union is preparing several responses against possible moves that could be taken by Moscow. Quoting a EU official, Reuters reported Monday that the 27-member bloc is seeking alternative sources of energy in case Russia cuts supplies to Europe. It's also preparing for the arrival of refugees should Russia invade Ukraine. Italy is mulling over whether to send up to 2,000 troops to Eastern Europe to bolster NATO's defense capability. The details will be finalized during a NATO defense ministers meeting in Brussels on Wednesday and Thursday. Italy's foreign minister is also set to visit Ukraine and Russia, seeking a diplomatic settlement of the crisis. Kim Yo-sun, Arirang News.
New satellite images show North Korea may have picked up activities at its uranium enrichment plant in Yongbyon. Now, this is according to a former official of the UN nuclear watchdog. Kim Da-mi has more.
North Korea appears to have restarted operations at its uranium enrichment plant in Yongbyon, producing the key material used in the production of nuclear bombs. Olli Heinonen, the former head of the IAEA and now a fellow at the Stimson Center, told VOA News that recent satellite imagery of plant shows snow melted on the roofs of the supply station and control room, suggesting the facility had been heated. Heinonen also pointed out a similar phenomenon at the site's 5-megawatt reactor, which is capable of producing about 6 kilograms of plutonium a year. But experts say the idea that the plant is operating is already widely accepted.
The North needs to continue experimenting to make its nuclear weapons lighter, more advanced, and more scientific. To do that, they need supplies, and Yongbyon is where they can produce plutonium and uranium.
The expert then warned that the regime will push ahead with its nuclear weapons and development in terms of both quality and quantity, and underlined the need to resume denuclearization talks at an early date. Following the report saying Yongbyon is operational, Seoul's Unification Ministry said Monday that South Korea is keeping close tabs on the North's nuclear and missile activities.
We're closely monitoring the North's nuclear and missile-related movements, including those at Yongbyon, based on close cooperation with the United States.
Observers have continued to report other signs of operations at Yongbyon as well, such as steam emanating from the site and restrictions on the movement of vehicles. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
Here on the local front, a rather worrying trend is taking shape with regard to employment. Fewer businesses are choosing to expand their workforce despite their growing profits. Our Kim Sung-min explains.
Recent data shows firms in South Korea that saw an increase in sales are more reluctant to hire more workers than in the past. According to a report by the Bank of Korea on Monday, average job growth from an increase in sales in the country has been trending downward for the past few years. For every 1 percentage point growth in sales, employment grew by 0.31 percentage points on average from 2014 to 2016, but over the next 3 years, the figure was just 0.27 percentage points. And the slowing trend in job growth from sales increases was more apparent in two sectors. The growth stalled the most, first in large manufacturing firms, and second in small firms in the service sector. For manufacturing, this is because companies are reinvesting that money into their facilities. For the service sector, the problem was intensifying competition. As competition intensifies, firms find it difficult for their prices to reflect cost increases. So the portion of cost in total sales ends up increasing, and this makes it hard for firms in the service sector, like accommodation and restaurants, to hire more people. Speaking to Arirang News, the author of the report suggests that policy improvements to support small service firms are needed to alleviate the problem.
To prevent firms from hiring fewer people due to stronger competition, measures are needed to help companies and services invest more in research and development. South Korea has a low level of R&D in the service sector.
The author also added that giving incentives to firms that achieve innovation through R&D could help companies less vulnerable to competition and as a result help them hire more workers. Kim Sung-min, Arirang News.
Over in Beijing, 2 Korean women figure skaters are making their Olympic debut on this Tuesday. Our Han Sang-woo gauges their medal prospects.
Women's figure skating, the jewel of the Winter Olympics, begins Tuesday evening, and representing South Korea will be Yoo Young and Kim Ye-rim. Both are competing in their first Winter Games. In late January, just before Beijing 2022, Kim won bronze at the International Skating Union 4 Continents Figure Skating Championships in Estonia, where Yoo finished 6th. But Yoo, the 2020 Winter Youth Olympics champion, is considered the nation's more likely bet at a medal. Pundits say, however, that she will have to flawlessly land her signature triple axel to have a shot at a podium spot over the more technically skilled Russian skaters. Among them will be the heavy favorite to win gold, Kamila Valieva of the Russian Olympic Committee, who has been the subject of great controversy for being allowed to take part in Tuesday's competition. Citing exceptional circumstances and the fact that Valieva is a, quote, protected person under World Anti-Doping Agency rules, the Court of Arbitration for Sport on Monday upheld an earlier decision by the Russian Anti-Doping Agency to lift a provisional suspension on the 15-year-old superstar after it was found she had tested positive for the banned heart medication tremetazidine on December 25th at the Russian National Championships. The drug test result was not revealed until February 8th, after she had competed in the team event at the Winter Games, winning gold. Valieva will be taking to the ice amid growing backlash against the ruling and Russia's long record of doping violations, resulting in its athletes competing under the ROC banner. Meanwhile, in bobsleigh, women's monobobsledder Kim Yu-ran finished 18th in the newly introduced event, which crowned Kaylee Humphreys of the United States as its inaugural Olympic champion. Beijing is Kim's second Olympics after Pyeongchang 2018, where she competed in the 2-woman event, finishing 14th. Han Sang-woo, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett arrived in Bahrain's capital on Monday, marking his first visit to the country since the Abraham Accord was struck. Speaking to reporters before takeoff, Bennett said he hoped the visit would be seen as a message of goodwill and a shared stance against common threats. During his 2-day trip, he'll meet with the Bahraini Crown Prince and Prime Minister Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa. Israel has previously offered to cooperate with its new Gulf partners, including Bahrain, on air defense, but it has not specified whether this might include selling the short-range rocket interceptor known as the Iron Dome. Big news for Greece as they're set to repay the final portions of bailout loans owed to the IMF by the end of March, 2 years ahead of schedule. Since then, it has made several early payments to the IMF and now owes $2.1 billion due in 2024. Greece still remains the Eurozone's most indebted nation, with public debt at almost 190% of GDP this year. The repayment is expected to help the country reduce the debt by roughly 1 percentage point and save about $56 million in interest rate payments. At least 1 person is dead and several others injured after 2 commuter trains collided at a train station near Munich in southern Germany on Monday. According to the police, the accident occurred in the late afternoon when 2 trains collided head-on with each other. The trains had been traveling on a single track. Due to the large scale of the rescue operation, a portion of the track had to be closed temporarily. Valentine's Day is a day filled with romance and affection. But Afghans had to scale back celebrations this year due to the return of the Taliban rule, which has enforced a strict version of Sharia law.
We had celebrated the past 2 years at a restaurant. Yesterday we went to a restaurant to make a reservation, but unfortunately we could not make a booking at any restaurant due to security issues and threats.
Flower shop owners also say that they used to see people buy flowers for their loved ones on February 14th, but now people are no longer purchasing them due to stricter laws and the tough economic situation. The Taliban had previously said cultural activities would be allowed as long as they don't go against Sharia law and Afghanistan's Islamic culture. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
A snowstorm in Beijing this past weekend led to a brief suspension of outdoor competitions. For more on the Olympic-related news, I have Fabienne Kretschmer live on the line. Fabienne, welcome back.
Hello from Beijing.
Right now, I hear the heavy snow is believed to have extinguished the Olympic flame at the Bird's Nest. Fabienne, do tell us more about that.
Well, the story goes back to a photograph by a journalist from USA Today, a US media, from Sunday, and he basically photographed the Olympic cauldron. That's where you usually can see the flame, but there was no visible flame left. So he assumed that due to the snowstorm and the very heavy wind on Sunday, maybe the flame was extinguished. However, the organizing committee said that everything is fine. I cannot really independently verify which version of the story is correct. However, it would not be the first time in the Olympic history that the Olympic flame would be extinguished. But yeah, I was here in Beijing and the weather was really not very favorable for the flame. So I think both versions could actually be true.
Right. And Fabienne, what is the latest with regard to the spread of COVID-19 in Beijing?
Yeah, rather successful. I mean, the latest numbers from today is that within Beijing, there are no new cases. In the whole Chinese mainland, there are 40 registered cases, so extremely low. Within the bubble, also, you could argue that the bubble worked so far because there were no infections registered that spread from the Olympic bubble to the rest of the population. So, yeah, rather successful news here on the epidemiological front.
Right, that is good to know. Now, Fabienne, you've spent, that is, quite some time under the so-called closed loop. What appears to be the toughest challenge of living within such stringent prevention boundaries?
Well, I mean, I think there are two issues here. I mean, the people who are taking part in the Olympic loop, I mean, who are the athletes or the journalists there, they have rather, restriction of movement and a lot of things. Here, I'm in Beijing and basically living like the rest of the population, and we have rather small inconveniences. For example, everywhere you go, you have to check in with your QR code. Even when I go home back to my flat, I have to pass a body temperature camera, etc. So I would say they are rather small inconveniences. However, the big problems for people like me, or in general, for people who have family outside of China, is the border closures. And it's not really easy for Chinese citizens, for example, to get a new passport. Only if you can prove that you have to do some essential travel, then you can leave the country. Also coming back, doesn't matter whether foreigner or Chinese citizen, it's really quite hard and very bureaucratic. And a lot of the flights are canceled. So, I mean, it basically separates a lot of families. And that is, I would say, the big tragedy.
Right. Fabienne, here in Korea, there has been quite a bit of local coverage on issues of cultural appropriation by China, as well as issues of penalties that appear to have aided Chinese athletes. What has been the focus of the foreign media on such matters of controversy?
Yeah, for the short track decision, I mean, for example, I'm German. I also followed it on German news, and it was covered, and it was basically portrayed as a very harsh decision. I mean, there was no final judgment given, but it was, noted that really those were rather controversial decisions. As for the Hamburg, I would say that it's rather perceived as a bilateral issue. From a German perspective, for example, most people are not so much aware that, for example, there's a Korean minority living in China. They don't know so much about the historical context. So I would say it has not received a lot of attention. But of course, here in China, it was a big topic, mostly among like influencers, but also among state media.
Right. And Fabienne, what are some of the stories that you believe will continue to make headlines as the Winter Games come to a close this coming Sunday?
Yeah, I think the big achievement of the Winter Games is basically bringing this event to a country that is traditionally not a winter sport country. And I don't see a lot of winter sport euphoria, but I think at least for some of the athletes and some of the disciplines, it will continue to spark the fire and keep the sports going. Politically, however, I think the achievement or what stays memorable is rather that it has shown that to what degree China and the West have drifted far from each other. I mean, there are huge gaps in the perception of how to judge the Olympic Games, what is the political context, etc. And my personal judgment is that in several weeks, or let's say in several months, there will not be much talk anymore about the Winter Games because frankly, we have different problems to deal right now, most of all the pandemic, and I don't think it will go into the history books. Yeah.
Right, Omicron is dominating international headlines as well. All right, Fabian, as always, thank you for the latest from the Winter Games over in Beijing.
Thank you.
Pundits have pointed to a number of external challenges to the local economy, ranging from the threat of warfare over Ukraine between Russia and Western allies to soaring oil prices. For more, I have Professor Yang Jung-sung from the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Happy to be here.
I also have Professor Oh Jun-seok from Soomyung Women's University. Professor Oh, welcome back.
Thank you for having me.
Right, Professor Yang, what would be the global economic toll of a Russian military invasion of Ukraine?
Okay, well, if there's a military response by all sides, then it becomes basically, at least in the short term, unpredictable. So I'm going to stay away from predicting that. But if there is a non-military response by the Western allies, then there will probably be an embargo. An economic embargo we can talk a little bit about. The most likely effect will be on oil prices. Some analysts have said that it might go as high as $120 per barrel if there is an invasion by Russia and if there's an embargo. This is not necessarily because Ukraine is a major producer of oil. In fact, it's only about 61st largest producer of oil, so it's in a sense of an oil producer, they're minuscule, but where they are important is that they channel a lot of gas, natural gas and oil from Russia to Europe. So that channel may be cut off. And then natural gas is especially important for Germany as a fuel oil, so it may add an additional demand for oil as well. So that accounts for a major reason why the oil prices will rise. But also we cannot rule out the possibility that Russia will limit exports as well. Russia is a top 3 oil producer and one of the largest exporters. As I said, the analysts are saying $120 per barrel. I wouldn't be surprised if it went above that for a very short period, a few days, especially after a shock of invasion and if the Western allies decide to have a military response. But oil prices will probably be the biggest hit on the global economy, and then there will be probably an additional effect on grain prices as well, because Ukraine is a major grain exporter to European nations, and once that grain supply has a shock, they will have to get grain from elsewhere. Now, problem with oil and grain is that they're what we call inelastic products. So even a tiny change in supply can lead to a very high response in prices. So that is the risk that we're facing right now.
Right. And Professor O, what are your thoughts on the potential impact of such hostile developments in Eastern Europe, perhaps on the Korean economy?
Yeah, Ukraine is located in the junction area between the European countries and Russia. And then the geopolitical tension being considered, I must say that it will be a hard blow to the Korean economy in 2 ways. First, international trade and international investment of Korea got a red alarm. As for export market, Ukraine is a big emerging market with a population of 43 million. So we paid more attention, and then Korean companies already invested a huge amount of money, and then there might be Korean companies might be Samsung Electronics, LG Electronics, and then Hyundai, POSCO International, and so on. So logistic-wise, Ukraine is a bridge connecting the Russian market with the European market. When gathered together, it could generate scale economy effects. So due to this kind of military tension, that the Korean export will be affected negatively, especially in the sector of cosmetics and the electronics and cell phone and automobiles. And secondly, as Professor Yang commented about that, global instability of supply. Russia is the #1 natural gas exporter, whereas Ukraine is named the breadbasket of Europe. So it's a major grain supplier in European countries. So military conflicts means the supply instability in an economy, which means the sharp increase of overall price in the market. It might trigger a vicious cycle in an economy. So we have to pay more attention on the trend of this kind of movement.
Right. Professor Yang, staying with the potential economic consequences for Korea, what look to be the repercussions of a prolonged confrontation with regard to the Ukraine situation?
Okay, well, I actually think that more prolonged and settled, as long as it does not go to actual armed conflict, we may have a bit of a stabilization after a few weeks. But before then, we will have problems with unstable global goods and financial markets. I'm currently a bit more worried about the financial markets. Usually when we have problems like this, where it involves possible armed conflict and possible large changes in the price of oil, what we see a lot of times is flight to safety. What we see is money taken out of the emerging market and then going into the United States, treasury bonds, even within a single country, you move from, say, risky investments like stock market into bond markets. So we may see a very rapid changes in both global and domestic financial markets, coupled with rising interest rates in the United States and Korea. So that's probably in the short run the biggest effect that we're going to see. In the longer run, as people get perhaps settled down, there is a possibility that other Middle East countries will increase their oil supply. There is possibility that because, well, Korea does have a lot of foreign investment in Ukraine, but in terms of just actual amount of exports and imports, they're less than 1% of Korea's total exports and imports. So if we get over the initial shock, it may not affect us that much in the trade account. If there is an armed conflict, Korea facilities in Ukraine may get damaged, but if they don't, I don't think it's in the interest of Russia or Ukraine to deliberately destroy those facilities, so it may go back online. But at least for the first few weeks, I think we will have a very large shock if Russia does decide to invade Ukraine.
Right. Professor, the standoff between Russia and Ukraine has been affecting energy and commodity markets, as Professor Yang mentioned earlier. What look to be the ramifications of this reality on the local economy here?
EU relationship with Russia is one of interdependence. Russian gas make up 40% of EU supplies, and at the same time, Russia still relies heavily on energy sales, more than 30% of their economy, and then more than 60% of its export. So I'd like to comment about the Korean domestic economy. As Professor Yang commented about the commonality of the two regions, in case of Russia, they have energy producers, and then in case of Ukraine, is a grain supplier. So their commonality of inelastic, which means the small changes is brought out a drastic volatility, wide volatility. So in that case, that energy price increase will cause overall production cost increase in Korea, in an economy, which will reduce the level of production and then decrease the investment and then unemployment and so on and so on. So in this process, the economic recovery from the pandemic will take longer than expected. But there is a catch. Go to the international economics. When Russia planned to this kind of military invasion, strategically they thought of they want to try to make an alliance with China. So think about it. No wonder there seems no compromise of trade conflicts between China and the United States. Number one and number two trade partner of Korea. So Korea might be stuck in the middle, and there will be a negative effect on the export forecast in 2022. Korea have to have a hard time finding a balanced diplomatic relationship without hurting the trade opportunities.
Right. Beyond Korea then, Professor Yang, what are the prospects of a hike in its key interest rate by the U.S. Federal Reserve that you mentioned, you touched upon earlier?
Okay, well, the United States, their January consumer price index inflation was 7.5%. That's the highest it's been since, I believe, 2008. That's on a 12-month basis. If you look at the subcategories, again, using the 12-month basis, the gasoline and used cars, their prices rose by more than 40%, and they account for a lot of the 7.5% increase. But because 7.5% increase is so big, there has been more and more comments, perhaps, that the United States will raise the interest rate by 5 to 7 times over this year. Previously, they were thinking about 3 or 4. And then in March, with the first rate increase, they may raise it by 0.5 percentage points rather than 0.25 as they usually do. The Fed has been trying to talk back that comment somewhat. The St. Louis Fed President Bullard had said that they may raise the rates 4 times by July, and realistically, that means they will have to raise the rates once by 0.5 percentage points. But he's been taking that back that comment and saying that nothing's been decided. There's a very good chance that there will be 0.25 percentage points. I personally think the first rate increase will be 0.25 percentage points because the Fed hasn't raised its rates for a long time, and I don't think they want to give too much of a shock to the system. But I think we realistically have to take into the possibility that United States will raise the rates more than 5 times this year, though I still think the most likely response is that they will raise it by 4 or 5 times and not necessarily 7 times like some of the investment banks are arguing.
Right. And staying in the U.S., Professor, what are your thoughts on the possible course of action that the U.S. Federal Reserve may choose to adopt?
Now, Federal Reserve must change and adjust it for their schedule originally planned. Let's think about a simple case. There is a pile of firewood in a stove, and then when the fire becomes bigger, and then it's too hot. So to control the heat, think about it. You may pour water into the stove. The stove is the economy, and the pile of wood is a money supply, and the heat is inflation. What about pouring water into the stove? That is interest rate hike. So this is a sudden change and that in line with modulate this kind of the sudden effect, they have to change the schedule. And then why that is because setting fire is more difficult to keeping fire. So it is true once COVID caused a bottleneck to the supply chain are resolved, that inflation will subside. So the tension due to the Russian troops buildup might be might be affected on the change of the schedule when some people say that Beijing Winter Olympic ends, that there might be a time of moment of movement. So there is room for slack. And then time of waiting for the next interest rate hikes.
Professor Yang, here on the domestic front, what are the implications of such external variables on Korea's financial market?
Okay, as I said before, the worries I have the most is if the Ukraine situation blows up with armed response, then we may get a very large shock in the global financial market and flight to safety. Now, usually Korea is classified as an emerging economy, so that means we may see a very large capital outflow going from Korea to the United States or other advanced countries. But there is, I think, a little bit of hope, because when we had the taper tantrum in 2013, the capital outflow wasn't as large as a lot of people expected, and the interpretation at that time was that people were taking Korea to be an advanced country rather than an emerging country. Perhaps Korea is acting more as a safety region rather than a risky region. But we only saw that in 2013, so that's speculation right now. Right now, the much more likely scenario is that if there is a flight to safety, we will see a very large movement out of Korea, a capital movement out of Korea into advanced countries. We will see a very large depreciation of the Korean won because of that. And even domestically, we will see a large drop in the stock market and moving into the bond market. It will probably be temporary, because that's what typically happens in an armed, unpredictable situation. But still, for a few weeks, we may be in a very volatile, unpredictable situation.
Professor Oh, moving forward, a number of countries in Europe as well as the US are seeking to transition into a new normal as the COVID-19 situation there appears to have reached its peak. Having said that, how does this reality look to affect global supply chains, do you think?
Using the economic terminology, it's a monetary veil. So in the short term, it could be possible, but as Professor Yang commented, it's a temporary. It cannot be sustainable. That is because this is an economic urgency, and then the market does not function well. So in time of urgency, the government take a role of circulating the economic cycle at the sacrifice of budget deficit. So it cannot be sustainable. So as time goes, the market shows and then uncover the veil, which means it might someone has to pay the price for the consumption eventually, which means the next generation have to pay the obligation. So in this sense, that in the long term, this kind of normalcy appearance might not be sustainable.
Right. And moving from the west back to the east, Professor Yang, some economists say that supply chain disruptions are being aggravated by China's zero-COVID policy amid Beijing's hosting of the Winter Games. Do you see an ease in disruptions once the Games end this weekend?
No. And the reason is that while the Olympics in China may play some minor part in supply chain disruption, it doesn't play a major part. The major part is due to, first of all, the supply problem is coronavirus. It's especially with the China's zero coronavirus policy. And it's not only China, it's other countries as well. Coronavirus is limiting supply in a lot of these factories. And then it's limiting movement in a lot of marine transportation. Again, that's not necessarily China. It's all the other countries as well. We have to remember some of the less developed countries, they still do not have vaccination, proper vaccination. They're still vaccinated less than 50% of their population. And the people who work on ships are among the last people to get vaccinated. And then there's also a shortage of containers that's still not worked itself out. And then the second problem, which is on the demand side, is that a lot of this disruption, supply chain disruption, is because there's a lot of demand for goods from the United States. Now, that may run itself out toward the latter part of the year as the interest rate goes up and U.S. savings that they built up during the pandemic goes down. But still, right now, the goods goods demand for goods from the United States does still seem to be strong, so it's taxing the limited infrastructure that we have right now. And just by the fact that China is finishing their Olympics and some areas in Beijing is being more liberalized to do what they want, I don't think that just freeing that certain region of China will do much to alleviate the global supply chain problem.
Right. And back on the domestic front, Professor O, inflation here in Korea has increased by over 3% every month since last October. Do you expect this trend to continue?
Yes, I'm afraid I think so. Of course, there is a growing doubt over whether the government will keep its target rate. Target rate of consumer price increase is 2.2%. But last year, consumer price is already over 2.5%. And the Bank of Korea changed its outlook for this year. Consumer price rise from 2.5, and then there happens a Russian military tension. It will add the cost of increase in the world. Korea might be affected as well, and then I suppose it will be up to 3% of price increase.
Right. Professor Yang, the central bank for its part has shared intentions to curb inflation by raising its key interest rate as well as dealing with rising household debt, of course. Having said that, what other options do you propose to tackle the latter, that would be the rising household debt here?
Okay, I think personally the debt service ratio regulation that they introduced, a lot of people see this as a barrier because it keeps them from buying houses and so on. But this debt service ratio regulation, DSR regulation, I think it's something that should have been incorporated into Korean lending from the beginning. Now, if you go to, say, United States or Europe, even without government regulation, they calculate your DSR anyway because that gives you a good idea on whether this person will be able to pay the debt back. And if this person has gotten too much into a debt problem that they cannot afford to pay, then the debt service ratio stops the bank from lending money to this person. So DSR regulation, it's been introduced by the government, but I think it's something that should have been introduced by the banks on their own, lenders on their own to begin with. Also, something similar should be applied, I think, to corporate loans as well. We've been mostly worried about household loans because that's the highest in percentage of GDP that in the OECD countries, but Korea also has a very large corporate debt as well. In fact, in terms of absolute amount, it's higher than the household debt. We feel a bit more safe about corporate debt because, well, debt is just part of regular management, but still, Korea is among the highest, so we should try to get a handle on corporate debt as well. And then there's the government debt, but that's a whole nother topic.
Right, it is, and hopefully we'll have time to talk about it some next time then. All right, Professor Yang, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts. Professor Oh, thank you for your insights today.
Thank you.
Right, on that note, we end this edition of the Daily Report. We'll be back on Wednesday with the latest on the Omicron outbreak. Thank you for now.
저는 메이저리그보다 태극마크를 단 마운드가 더 자랑스럽습니다. 내가 대한민국이다.